Even our simplest lexically expressible concepts such as dog, table, or tree provide abstract perspectives from which to think and talk about things in the world. So, for example, the concept dog provides an abstract perspective from which to think about and talk about the world, in which a particular thing is thought of as being one of an unlimited number of things of the same kind. Furthermore, a concept such as dog provides an abstract perspective which allows us to think and talk about a particular thing as simultaneously unique and utterly non-unique within the kind. It also provides a perspective which allows us to think about the abstract kind to which the object belongs. So, for example, we can think thoughts like dogs evolved from wolves, where it's a statement about the kind dog and its relation to the kind wolf. It is not about members of the category dog and their relation to members of the category wolf. Furthermore, concepts like dog provide a perspective in which we can think and talk of some of the thing's properties as being explained by its being the kind of thing it is. So, for example, we may think that Fido has 4 legs because he's a dog, though we don't think that he is brown because he's a dog or that he wears collars because he's a dog. Similarly, such concepts provide a perspective in which we can think some of the thing's properties as being properties that the object is supposed to have because it is the kind of thing it is, and that there's something wrong with it if it doesn't have that property. So the concept dog allows us to think that dogs are supposed to have 4 legs, and dogs that don't have 4 legs have something wrong with them. All of these characteristics listed on this slide are characteristics of the perspective we take when we think and talk about dogs. These are not characteristics of dogs per se. Instead, they're part of the perspective that the concept dog provides us and the way we think about dogs. Perspectives are not properties of the things that the concept represents. Instead, they're properties of what we may call the mental lens that the concept provides. And it turns out that these perspectives that are provided by lexically expressible concepts are linguistically relevant for a number of phenomena, including generics, polysemy, and a few other phenomena we'll be pointing out along the way. The existence of such perspectives raise a number of difficult questions. First, how are perspectives represented? Second, how are perspectives acquired? Remember, perspectives aren't properties of the things that are represented by the concept. So you can't learn the perspective by looking at the properties of the things represented. And so the question arises, how do we acquire these perspectives? And that problem is made more complicated by the fact that each of the items listed here is a concept that belongs to a class which provides a distinct set of perspectives from every other item listed here. So each of them belong to a distinct class. They provide overlapping perspectives, and yet they're not the same set of perspectives. So that complicates the acquisition problem. The child has to acquire not just one set of abstract perspective, but many different classes of perspectives. Also, insofar as conceptual representations in animals do not provide such perspectives, it raises the question of how perspectives of this sort evolved. it also raises a question of how children know which perspective a given word should be mapped onto, and the question of how we learn the linguistic means by which one or another perspective provided by a concept is selected in a given utterance. In this talk, I will be focusing mostly on questions 1 and 2, as that will take all the time we have. And the claim I'm going to make is that concepts, like sentences, have formal structures. Now, the formal structure of a sentence provides instructions for how to interpret the relations between the contentful elements that enter into a sentence's meaning. So illustrated on this slide, I have the 2 syntactic structures that can be assigned to the sequence of words, I shot an elephant in my pajamas. And the 2 syntactic structures give different instructions for how we should think of the relations amongst the meanings of the words that go into the meaning of the sentence. So in one case, the elephant is wearing the pajamas and the photographer is taking a picture of the elephant. In the other case, the photographer is wearing the pajamas and taking the picture of an elephant, which is not wearing the pajamas. So what we see here is that different syntactic structures convey different meanings for the same set of elements. They provide different perspectives for thinking about how the meaningful elements in the sentence are related to one another. My suggestion is that conceptual form provides instructions for interpretation of a concept's contentful elements, and thus provides the perspectives that the concept provides, encodes those perspectives. Now, standard approaches to conceptual representation do not address this question of perspectives at all. Instead, they are focused largely on categorization and what kind of properties a thing must have in order to be categorized as belonging in one or another category, as a dog, a table, a tree, so on and so forth. And different approaches specify what properties are important and what relations amongst properties are important in order for something to be categorized as belonging in a given category. Notice that in this case, the focus is on properties of the things represented and the relations amongst properties of the things represented. These approaches do not consider the form of the conceptual representation itself. And it is the form of the conceptual representation which encodes the perspective that we take when we use that concept to think about something. Now, obviously, conceptual structure has to support categorization, but it must also support how we think about category members and the category itself. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on the fact that concepts such as dog must support the perspective outlined in these 5 points that I spoke about earlier. And we'll want to see what kind of structure the concept has to have so that it provides this perspective. Now, by looking at dogs or members of any given category, we can learn about the statistical structure which is present in the category, correlations amongst features, how frequent different features are, so on and so forth. We can also study category members to learn about the causal structure which is present in the category and how different features are causally connected to one another. But what is missing from these standard approaches to conceptual representation is a third hidden dimension of conceptual structure, which pertains to the formal structure or conceptual form of the concept. And this provides the perspective that the concept provides. It encodes the perspective that the concept provides. And I will be focusing in today's talk on the perspective that kind concepts provide. And a core characteristic of kind concepts is that they require a mechanism that allows us to represent an object as one of an unlimited number of objects of the same kind. So at its core, a concept such as dog or table or tree, a kind concept, has to have a mechanism for representing something as one of an unlimited number of objects of the same kind. That is something which standard approaches to conceptual representation have not addressed. So, because we can think of an unlimited number of instances of a kind, and we cannot enumerate all of them, we need to represent a generative mechanism which can generate an unlimited number of instance of kind representations, each of which allows us to think about a distinct instance of that kind. So the idea is that a concept such as dog or table or tree, at its core, is a generative mechanism, here represented as Ki, which allows us to generate an unlimited number of instance of kind representations, down here represented as K1, K2, K3, and so on and so forth. Each of these provides us with the means for thinking and talking about a distinct instance of that kind. So K1 might allow us to think about Fido, K2 Spot, K3 Rover, and so on and so forth. And because this generative mechanism implicitly contains this unlimited number of instances of the kind, it provides the means for thinking about the kind itself. Okay. Now, focusing on the instance of kind representations, we see that thinking about things as instances of kinds requires that the representation have at least two components. One component represents the kind of thing something is, and this is, of course, shared by all instance of kind representations of that kind. The second component represents that what distinguishes the instance from all other instances of that kind. And here it's represented via an index which has no intrinsic descriptive content. And this captures the fact that we can think of two instances of a kind as being qualitatively identical. So Spot and Rover can be qualitatively identical and yet be two distinct dogs. A third characteristic that needs to be added to instance of kind representations is a distinction between actually existing instances and potentially existing instances. Since we can think of an unlimited number of instances of any given kind, we need to distinguish between those instances which actually exist or existed and those which don't actually exist but exist only potentially. And I'm going to suggest that we add one more index, in this case a untyped index, which actually existing instances have but potentially existing instances lack. And I'm going to use Greek letters here for the untyped index. Okay. Now, on this slide, I have represented the proposal so far described, but in a different format. This visual format, you will see, will make it easier to compare different kind representations, which we will be doing later in the talk. So this green square here with the arrow represents the generative mechanism and the kind itself. And these brown elements down here are each different instance of kind elements, representations. And some of these are actually existing and others are potentially existing. Okay, so The question we must next address is, how do we distinguish kind representations? Because we can think of more than one kind of thing. Now, one might wonder whether we could distinguish kind representations the same way we represent instance of kind representations through an index with no intrinsic descriptive content. But if we think for a moment, we'll see that this doesn't make any sense. For example, if I told you that there are two kinds of things, dogs and schmogs, but they are qualitatively identical, you would say, wait, it must be that there is some difference between dogs and schmogs, because if there isn't, then all you have is a single kind with two different names for that one kind. Notice that you don't have that same feeling if I'm talking about instance of kind representations. So I can tell you that Fido and Rover are absolutely identical, and yet they're distinct dogs, and there's no problem with that. You don't feel like you're forced to say, hey, no, if there really are two dogs that are qualitatively identical, then they have different names, it must be that there's really only one dog with two names. In fact, you could see both Fido and Spot and see that they're two distinct dogs that are qualitatively identical. We can't do that for kinds which are intrinsically abstract. And what that means is that to distinguish kind representations, we need to add another component to the form of the concept, this orange part here, which is going to contain the information which qualitatively characterizes the kind and distinguishes that kind from other kinds. Okay, so now the question arises as to how these properties that characterize the kind are connected to the kind. And for different kinds of things, there are going to be different sets of properties, but what we can hope for is that there's one way in which all kinds are characterized by the properties that characterize them. And the proposal I'm going to make is that for all kinds, kinds are characterized and distinguished from one another by the properties they have by virtue of being the kinds of things they are. So this is a special type of connection here where kinds are connected to properties that they have by virtue of being the kinds of things that they are. And the question then becomes, does our conceptual system distinguish properties that kinds have by virtue of being the kinds of things that they are from properties that are connected to the kind in other ways? And here the answer is yes. In a number of papers, both from my lab and from other labs, it has been shown that properties that we believe to be true of a kind by virtue of its being the kind of thing it is are systematically distinguished from properties that are connected to the kind in other ways. In particular, properties that kinds have by virtue of being the kinds of things they are properties that we say have a principal connection to the kind. And those properties have been shown to license formal explanations. So it sounds good to say something like that has four legs because it's a dog, because we understand having four legs as a property of dogs that dogs have by virtue of being the kinds of things they are. They also license normative expectations. We think dogs should have four legs, and that a dog that doesn't have four legs has something wrong with it. They license the expectation that the properties will generally be present in instances of a kind. And they are understood to be represented as an aspect of being that kind of thing. So, for example, we think having four legs is one aspect or one part of being a dog. That's not all there is to being a dog, but that is an aspect of being a dog. And properties that have a principal connection to the kind are distinguished from properties that have other types of connections along these dimensions. In particular, properties that have a principal connection to the kind are understood to be an aspect of being that kind of thing. So having four legs is understood to be an aspect of being a dog. And these kinds of connections are distinguished from causal connections, where properties are understood to be a consequence of being that kind of thing. So in mosquitoes carry West Nile virus, we don't think of carrying West Nile virus as being an aspect of being a mosquito, but we do think it's a consequence of being a mosquito under certain conditions. And both of these ways of connecting properties are distinguished from statistical connections. These are properties that are neither understood to be an aspect of being a given kind of thing or a consequence of being that kind of thing, but are nevertheless lawfully connected to the kind. So barns are red. We don't think being red is an aspect of being a barn or a consequence of being a barn. Nevertheless, we think barns generally are red. They're external conditions which lead to that systematically being true. Okay, so the important point for right now is that our minds distinguish principal connections as an aspect of being a given kind of thing. And these are properties that we understand a kind to have by virtue of its being the kind of thing it is. So we have evidence for the formal structure of a kind concept having this type of a connection to the properties that characterize and distinguish the kind. And just as a reminder, these are properties that the kind is understood as having by virtue of being the kind of thing they are, and they license formal explanations, license normative expectations. They license the expectation that properties will generally be present in instances of the kind and are represented as an aspect of being that kind of thing. These are characteristics of principal connections, but not causal or statistical connections, except, of course, the expectation that they'll be generally present in instances of kind is true of statistical connections. Now, we are hypothesizing that there is this special type of connection that is represented in the form of a concept, which allows us to characterize and distinguish one kind from another, and that special connection has these characteristics. But one can ask, is it really the case that these different signatures are intrinsically connected and part of a single connection type, principal connections, or if it might be the case that these are all facts about kinds and properties that we've learned separately. So we might separately have learned that you could explain why dogs have four legs by pointing to the fact that they're dogs, or you would then separately learn that dogs are supposed to have four legs and that there's something wrong with a dog that doesn't have four legs. And you learn separately that it makes sense to think of having four legs as an aspect of being a dog. That was now, given that the experiments that I've pointed to up to now are experiments that were done with adults with known kinds, it was possible that these might have been learned separately. These facts might have been separately learned facts about a given kind and property, rather than reflections of a single principal connection, which we are hypothesizing is a part of the lens that kind concepts provide. To test between these two possibilities, we ran experiments in which we taught people about novel kinds where they obviously have no prior knowledge, And we did so either through an introduction frame, which gave evidence that the property has a principal connection to the kind, or through an introduction frame where we didn't give any evidence that the property has a principal connection to the kind. For example, almost all blicks have fur suggests a strong statistical connection, but it doesn't implicate a principal connection. And it has fur and it is blick gives no information about whether or not there's a principal connection between the kind and the property. In contrast to having fur is one part of being a blick. It has fur because it's a blick, or blicks by virtue of being blicks have fur. These are, and a blick by virtue of being a blick has fur. All four of these give clear evidence that there's a principal connection between the kind and the property. And the question is, now do participants automatically infer a different reflection of principal connections, one for which we gave them no direct evidence? And to test for this, we looked at the normative expectations. So now participants are shown another blick and they're told this one does not have fur. And the question is there something wrong with it because it does not have fur? And as predicted, if participants were taught of the property for the novel kind using a principal connection introduction frame, they assumed that there was something wrong with the blick that didn't have fur. On the other hand, if they were taught about the property using either strong statistical evidence or no information about connection type, they did not form that expectation. So what these data show is that these distinct signatures of principal connections are in fact reflections of a single connection type, which is part of the mental lens provided by concepts such as dog, and rather than separately learned generalizations about the kind and the property. Of course, these data come from adults, and so you might think that maybe with a lifetime of learning about specific kinds and properties and seeing that you have a number of these types of generalizations that are true, maybe they become connected later in life rather than being an intrinsic part of the form of the concept. And so we did a similar experiment which showed that 4 and 5-year-olds also have an intrinsic connection between the explanatory and normative aspects of principal connections. So the experiment was similar to the previous one, though simplified, so that it could be done with 4 and 5-year-olds. And participants are taught about the novel kind using a signature of principal connections, such as it has fur because it is a blick, or given no information about the connection type. It has fur and it is a blick. And what you can see is that both 4 and 5-year-olds as well as adults inferred that there's something wrong with a blick if it doesn't have fur, if they were taught in the principal connection signature condition, but not in the no information condition. So these data suggest that in fact, the formal structure of a kind concept includes in it principal connections, and principal connections have these distinct characteristics which allow us to characterize kinds and distinguish them from other kinds. Okay, so there you have some evidence concerning what the formal structure of the kind representation is. Now I want to turn to an experiment that bears on evidence for the conceptual form of instance of kind representations. So instance of kind representations can be formally distinguished from one another in 2 ways. So here you have the instance of kind representations, let's say, of pumpkins and carriages, and you can distinguish amongst instances within a kind through the typed index, which distinguishes actually and potentially existing instances within a kind. You can also distinguish instance of kind representations via the untyped index that actually existing instances have, and that this way of distinguishing instances allows you to distinguish between actually existing instances both within and across kinds. So this actually existing pumpkin is distinct from this actually existing pumpkin, and it's also distinct from this actually existing carriage. Okay, so given this proposal for the instance of kind representation, we tested the proposal in the following way. If instance of object kind representations provide the means to think and talk about numerically distinct things, participants should reject the possibility of their being related as two phases of a single existent that undergoes a transformation. And the two ways of distinguishing instance of object kind representations make different predictions about which transformations an instance of an object kind may undergo. Here, I will make this clearer for you using the following examples. So the type index distinguishes actually and potentially existing instances within a kind. And in so doing, it implicates a uniqueness in kind constraint, whereby an instance of a given object kind is always thought to be distinct from other actually and potentially existing instances of that kind. And so it makes the prediction that participants should reject the possibility of transforming an actually existing instance of an object kind into a potentially existing instance of the same kind. But it leaves open the possibility of an actually existing instance of one kind being transformed into a potentially existing instance of a different object kind. And here is a concrete example. So here you have three actually existing pumpkins, one potentially existing pumpkin, and what the uniqueness in kind constraint implies is that you can't turn an actually existing pumpkin, say pumpkin 1, into a different, initially potentially existing pumpkin. That is not possible. On the other hand, it says it is possible to turn an actually existing pumpkin into a potentially existing carriage, which then becomes an actually existing carriage. Turning to the untyped indices, we see that they distinguish actually existing instances within and across kinds. And in so doing, it implicates a mode of existing constraint, whereby an actually existing instance of an object kind must be thought to be distinct from all actually existing instances of that kind and other object kinds also. And so it makes the prediction that participants should reject the possibility of transforming an actually existing instance of an object kind into an actually existing instance of either the same or a different object kind. So what this constraint implies that people should reject the possibility of turning an actually existing pumpkin into an actually existing carriage, and they should equally resist the possibility of an actually existing carriage being turned into a different actually existing carriage. We tested this prediction using stimuli of the following sort. So imagine an already existing monkey, monkey 37, that is transformed into a newly created monkey, monkey 72. That's the within kind, which should be ruled out. And across kind, imagine an already existing monkey, monkey 37, that is transformed into a newly created beaver, beaver 72, which should be a possibility. And participants had to say for these putative transformations whether they could ever happen. And what we found is that participants rejected the possibility of transforming an actually existing instance into a potentially existing instance within the same kind, more often than across kinds, as predicted by the uniqueness in kind constraint. The mode of existence constraint was tested just by making a small change. So as before, you start with an actually existing instance of a kind, except now the putative transformation turns it into another actually existing instance of either the same kind or a different kind. And what you can see here is consistent with the mode of existence constraint. People reject this transformation both within and across kinds. So these experiments provide evidence for the conceptual form hypothesized for instance of kind representations. So the conceptual form of concepts like dogs is what we sketched out in this diagram, and it allows us to think of a particular thing as one of an unlimited number of things of the same kind, because the kind is represented via generative mechanism. It allows us to think of a particular thing as simultaneously unique and utterly non-unique within the kind. That's via the type index and the uniqueness in kind constraint. It allows us to think of some of a thing's properties as being explained by its being the kind of thing it is, because there's a principal connection between the kind and the properties that characterize and distinguish it. It also allows us to think of some of things' properties as being properties the object is supposed to have because it's the kind of thing it is. Once again, because of the principal connection it represents between the kind and some properties. And then finally, it allows for the possibility to think about the abstract kind to which the object belongs, because there's a distinct representation of the kind itself from that of the instance of kind representations. And so here we see how we can make progress on how we represent perspectives by sketching out what the formal characteristics of the conceptual representations have to be in order for us to think with a perspective of the sort that is provided by kind concepts. And then this conceptual form allows us to study the members of the category and learn about their statistical and causal characteristics. But this structure is built into the conceptual form itself, the conceptual representation itself. Now, we need to elaborate that formal structure a little bit, because it turns out that we have two ways of thinking about kinds. We can think of kinds as containing concrete instances, which is what we've been focusing on so far, but we can also think of them as containing abstract kinds. And evidence from this comes from the fact that an expression such as two dogs is ambiguous, in that I can use it, for example, to talk about instances. So two dogs I like are Fido and Spot, but I can also use it to talk about subkinds. So two dogs I like are Collies and Dachshunds. And what this suggests is that what we need to do is elaborate our formal structure for kind concepts to include subkinds. So this is the kind dog. Here are instances of the kind dog, Fido, Spot, Rover. These are subkinds, Collies, Dachshunds, German Shepherds, so on and so forth. And these are instances which are of those sort. And of course, all of these are going to have to be indexed with some actual dog representations, but we're going to leave that out for simplicity. Okay. So that suggests that there's a kind of relation represented between different kind representations, and we need to distinguish those from the class inclusion relations that one might have between the members of different classes. And some evidence from this comes from an experiment in which we gave participants statements that either involved a kind specification relation between kind terms. So to be a collie is a specific way to be a dog, or between a phrasal expression and a kind expression. So to be a brown dog is a specific way to be a dog. The idea being the first should sound good because it's relating two kinds through a kind of relation, whereas brown dog identifies a class of dogs, not a kind of dogs. And in this case, the kind of relation should sound odd. On the other hand, it should sound odd to say to be a collie is to be something in addition to being a dog, but it should sound perfectly fine where you have a phrasal concept which identifies a class of things. So for example, to be a brown dog is to be something in addition to being a dog, namely brown, should sound good. And we get the predicted interaction in that lexical nominals are interpreted as names for kinds and thus support the kind specification relation. But phrasal expressions identify classes of things, and the kind of expression sounds odd there. Okay, so there we have a little bit of evidence for this kind of relation being represented between kinds and subkinds. What I want to do now is suggest that here on this slide, we have the basic formal structure, which is present in concepts such as dog, and it provides a perspective which has the characteristics that we showed earlier. But another advantage of this formal structure is it has the key components that can be used to generate other perspectives which are embodied in other lexically expressible concepts. And so what I'm going to do in this next part of the talk is show you how we can generate other lexically expressible concepts with the abstract perspectives that they provide by looking to see whether each of these components is present and different ways in which it can be realized. So let's turn to that task. So we can ask, are there kinds that contain subkinds, but no instances directly? So recall, the prototypical concept, such as dog, contains both instances and subkinds directly. And I'm going to suggest that, in fact, there are concepts, superordinate concepts such as animal, where they directly contain subkinds, but they don't directly contain any instances. And so they have a formal structure of this sort. And what this helps explain is a very important characteristic of how we think about things when we use the concept animal. And in particular, it captures the intuition that something cannot simply be an animal without being some kind of animal. Notice that something could simply be a dog without being some specific kind of dog, but we don't have that intuition about animal. And we can see this by the fact that if I say I saw two animals lurking in the bush, we have to understand this as I saw two animals of unspecified kind lurking in the bush. Notice, however, that there's no such pressure if I had used a similar sentence using dog. So I saw two dogs lurking in the bush. We don't have to say, oh, that really is expressing the idea that I saw two dogs of unspecified kind lurking in the bush. And the formal structure being proposed for concepts such as animal also helps explain why there is a pull to think that the animals are of different kinds. That is, since we are quantifying them, we can't specify the specific kind if they're different kinds of things, and that's that explains the pull for when someone said, I saw two animals lurking in the bush, towards the idea that the animals are not of the same kind. Also, it explains why it supports the inference that the speaker may not know the kind identity of the instances, because obviously if they don't know the identity of the instances, then they can't specify it. So this formal structure both captures a semantic condition as well as some pragmatic conditions that seem to govern how we understand the use of the word animal. Okay, on the previous slide, we had a kind concept which contains subkinds, but no instances directly. On this slide, we have a formal structure where the kind concept directly contains instances of kinds, but no subkinds. So for example, concepts such as rook seems to be one of those. So if I say, I like two rooks, there's only the instance of kind understanding. It doesn't seem to be ambiguous and have an interpretation where it means I like two kinds of rooks, though of course we can explicitly say I like two kinds of rooks. We can create an ad hoc subkind of kinds of rooks by specifying the basis for distinguishing kinds of rooks. But the idea is that rooks, by virtue of being rooks, do not specify a way of there being different kinds of rooks. Okay, so here is another possibility that gets generated, in that we can have kinds that contain subkinds and instances, but whose instances are ad hoc instances that we can only think and talk about through the combination of concepts and through the use of contextual information, not contained in the kind. And here we can think of concepts such as sand or mud. So if I say there are two sands on this beach, you readily get the interpretation that there are two kinds of sands on the beach, and there are two distinct ways of being sand. So you get the subkind interpretation. You don't need contextual information in order to generate that interpretation. On the other hand, we could also interpret it as referring to portions of sand, but now, or two instances of sand, but now we must require on contextual and conventional information to help us identify what was going to count as an instance. The kind sand doesn't tell us what is going to count as an instance. Okay. Now returning to our basic prototype, what we see here is that there are concrete instance representations that are numerically distinguished, and there are abstract kinds or subkinds, which are distinguished by their character. We can ask, are there, in addition to there being concrete instances, also abstract instances of object kinds? And are they then distinguished the way that abstract subkinds are, or the way that concrete instances are? And it turns out that, in fact, we can have abstract instances of object kinds in addition to concrete instances. So when Sally and Sue read the same book, it could be that there are numerically distinct books that they both read, and in fact, they don't need to be even perceptually similar to one another. Similarly, Sally and Sue are wearing the same necklace can be true when there are distinct necklaces that Sally and Sue are wearing, not one big necklace that they're both wearing. But in this case, it has to be that the distinct necklaces that Sally and Sue are wearing are perceptually similar. They don't have to be identical, but they do need to be perceptually similar. So these data suggests that we're going to have to add perspective in which the kind contains abstract instances as well as concrete instances. And whereas the concrete instances are just distinguished numerically and need not be qualitatively distinct from one another, the abstract instances do need to differ in qualitative ways. So syntactic structures and schmintactic structures must have different content. They can't be qualitatively identical. Okay, now one can ask, are there kinds in which concrete instances must be distinguished via their character in addition to being distinguished numerically? And it turns out that there are. So if we think of persons, they numerically distinct persons cannot have the same character. So that suggests that the kind person has numerically distinct concrete instances, but these are not merely numerically distinct concrete instances. Each one has its own individual character, personality, and knowledge, and so on and so forth. All right. So we can now turn to the component which characterizes and distinguishes kinds. And we can ask, given that they're both abstract and concrete individuals, are there also abstract and concrete ways of individuating kinds? And it turns out that there are. So there are some kinds that we can characterize and distinguish from other kinds, either through abstract values or through concrete properties. So in work with Josh Nobe and George Newman, we saw that you can characterize a scientist in terms of abstract values. For example, there's someone who systematically makes observations and tries to draw conclusions about the nature of the empirical world using experimental procedures and rational inference, or some such thing. Or you could characterize scientists in terms of the concrete descriptive properties, such as has a degree in science, works as a scientist, does experiments, publishes in science journals, so on and so forth. On the other hand, for other categories, it seems like we only have the descriptive features to characterize them. So categories such as pharmacists, there don't seem to be a set of abstract values that we can use to characterize pharmacists and distinguish them from non-pharmacists. We must rely on concrete descriptive characteristic to do so. And so it turns out that there are some concepts which are dual character concepts, such as scientists, and others which are just single character concepts. And we get evidence for this because given that there are two ways of characterizing these kinds, you should be able to have categorizations based on one or the other criteria. So for example, for a scientist, you could imagine someone who is not trained as a scientist, but in every decision she makes, she looks systematically at all the available evidence and does manipulations to see what the important factors are governing how the thing behaves, and then draws conclusions of this person. You might say there's a sense in which she's clearly not a scientist. She wasn't trained as one. She doesn't work as one. But there's a sense in which she's a true scientist because she embodies the values that characterize and distinguish scientists from non-scientists. You could also have the flip side, where you have someone that has all the descriptive characteristics of a scientist, is trained as a scientist, works as a scientist, But you know what? Does not care at all about figuring out how the world works. He's in it for the fame and fortune, makes up his data, and so on and so forth. Now, of this person, you might say there's a sense in which he's clearly a scientist. But when you think about what it really means to be a scientist, you'd have to say he's not a scientist at all. And but you can't make these two ways of categorizing for concepts such as pharmacist, and that is what we found. In that, if you give participants descriptions of this following sort, there's a sense in which she is clearly not a scientist, but ultimately, if you think about what it really means to be a scientist, you'd have to say that there is a sense in which she's a true scientist. After all, people should find that to be a coherent thing to say for concepts such as scientists, but not for concepts such as pharmacists. And then you could also have scenarios where of the following sort. There's a sense in which she's clearly a scientist, but ultimately, if you think about what it really means to be a scientist, you'd have to say that there's a sense in which she's not a scientist at all. Once again, this statement should make sense for dual character concepts such as scientists, but not for the control concepts such as pharmacist. And that is, in fact, what we find. Furthermore, we find evidence that there are two ways of evaluating these dual character concepts. We can do it in descriptive terms, where we basically look to see how many of the characteristics, descriptive characteristics, an instance has. The more they have, the better example it is of that category. You could do this for both types of concepts, so it should sound fine to say that is a good X for both dual character and control concepts. On the other hand, you could also evaluate members of dual character categories by the extent to which they embody the values that characterize that concept. And this should be possible for dual character concepts, but not for the control concepts. And that is, in fact, what we found. Okay, so it turns out that we can characterize kinds both in abstract and in concrete terms. But of course, there are other ways in which we can distinguish between kinds. And the question is, well, how do we distinguish the perspectives provided by different kinds of kinds? And one possibility is that because this component has a formal explanatory link to the kind representation, we should be able to distinguish different kinds of kinds based on the formal explanatory structure that is present in different types of kinds. And in particular, we can maybe distinguish different kinds of kinds by the number and types of explanatorily central properties they have principal connections to. And here we turn to Aristotle for explanatorily central characteristics. Aristotle pointed out that there are 4 ways in which we can explain things. We have been focusing on formal explanations, where we explain things by reference to the kind of thing something is or what it is. So why does that have the shape it does? Because it's a chair. But other characteristics we can explain only if we make reference to what it's constituted of. So why does that burn? Not because it's a chair, but because it's made of wood. And then we can also explain characteristics by reference to what produces them. So why does that have the shape it does? Well, it's because the carpenter hammered nails and cut this wood in a certain way. And so these are the causal forces and the things that produce this thing. And then finally, we can explain things by reference to the sake for which something exists. So why does that have the shape it does? So that we can sit on it. right? Where we make reference to a functional characteristic, which explains why the thing exists or has the characteristics it does. So the proposal is, given that these are 4 ways in which we can make sense of the world, and that concepts provide us with a perspective from which to think and reason about things, that we can distinguish different kinds of kinds by the types of explanatorily central properties that a given kind has principal connections to. So does it have principal connections to what it's constituted of, to what produced it, or to the types of functional characteristics it has? Each of these components can be realized in different ways. So what something is constituted of can either be discrete parts or stuff. What produced something could be the same kind of thing, a different kind of thing. So living things, dogs produce dogs, cats produce cats. Whereas artifactual things are produced by different kinds. So spiders produce spider webs, humans produce chairs. Or you can have kinds where it's no specific kind that produces it. So our understanding of a mountain is it can be produced by any kind of causal force or combination of causal forces. So earthquakes, tectonic shifts, erosion, whatever, some set of causal forces lead to it having the form and size of a mountain, then it's a mountain. In that sense, it differs from the way we think about artifacts or living things, where we have ideas about the specific kinds that must produce them. And then finally, with respect to the teleological component, the functional capacities can be monadic, such as growth, which relates a thing to itself. Dyadic, in examples are goal-directed movement or perception, which are both intrinsically dyadic capacities, or intrinsically triadic capacities, such as explanation and reason. Okay, and it turns out that if we distinguish kinds of kinds based on whether they have principal connections to these distinct components and how they're realized, we can generate an ontology which is very similar to our common sense ontology, suggesting that there's something right about this way of distinguishing between different kinds of kinds. Okay, so up to now, we have focused on the fact that kinds are characterized by a set of properties that they have by virtue of being the kinds of things they are. But we haven't asked the question whether all properties characterize instances in the same way. Kind of assume that that is the case, but there are data that call that into question. So it sounds perfectly fine to say something like lions have manes. Now that should be surprising and confusing because, as we all know, less than 50% of lions have manes. It's only the healthy adult male lions that have manes. And what makes this perplexing is that it nevertheless seems to be that there's a principal connection between the kind lion and the property of having manes, where, for example, it sounds pretty good to say that has a mane because it's a lion, and also that lions are supposed to have manes. In fact, we have data which suggests that is the case. So there's a puzzle as to how we're to interpret these generic sentences and what they mean for how we represent the kind and its connection to a characteristic such as manes. Now, one popular idea in the linguistics literature is that these types of sentences are understood in terms of domain restriction. So lions have manes means something like lions of the relevant kind have manes, which in this case will be restricted to male lions, adult male lions. And of course, this raises all kinds of problems as to how do you restrict the domain in the right way, and how does your way of restricting domains not let in all kinds of illegitimate generics. And there are more or less sophisticated ways of trying to address this problem. But what I want to suggest to you is that this is the wrong kind of solution. It is the wrong kind of solution because it says that having manes is systematically connected only to some subset of lions, and that we don't have any ideas about how manes are connected to other types of lions. That seems to be false, and we want to suggest instead that we do have a principal connection represented between lions and manes, but we think that there's a principal connection between being a male lion and the presence of a mane, and we think that there's a principal connection between being a female lion and the absence of a mane. And we tested this prediction in a set of experiments. So, for example, we would give participants questions of the following sort. Why does that, pointing to a duck, lay eggs, where it's a sex-specific characteristic? And then they're given answers such as because it's a duck, a female duck, a male duck, or they're asked to explain the absence of the sex-specific property. So why does that, pointing to a duck, not lay eggs? Because it's a duck, female duck, or male duck. And as predicted, people like the response where you make reference to the kind, duck, but even better is an explanation that makes reference to the sex-linked members of the kind. So because it's a female duck, and of course it's not very good to try to explain it by reference to the sex not linked to the kind because it's a male duck. And you get the converse pattern when asked to explain the absence of the property. Why does that not lay eggs? Well, now, because it's a male duck is good, and because it's a duck or because it's a female duck are both bad. So we see that there are formal explanations for both the presence and absence of the property in instances of the kind. Turning to normative expectations, participants were given statements such as ducks are supposed to lay eggs, or female ducks are supposed to lay eggs, or male ducks are supposed to lay eggs, or about the absence of the property. So ducks or female ducks or male ducks are supposed to not lay eggs. And as predicted, when it's the presence of the property, both the kind statements or the statements involving the sex-linked members of the kind sound good, but not those for the sex not linked to the property. In contrast, when the statements include the absence of the property, now it's the sex not linked to the kind that sound good with respect to normative expectations. And so what this suggests is that there are some properties, properties of type Y and properties of type Y prime, which help characterize a principal division within a kind, and instances that are supposed to have property of type Y are understood to supposed to not have property of type Y prime, and vice versa. And so we need to include these distinct property types in terms of capturing how we think about animate kinds and the fact that there are principal divisions within the instances of animate kinds into male and female, for example. But it will probably also work for other divisions that are principled, such as worker bees versus queen bees. Okay, what I hope to have shown you in this last part of the talk is that we can generate a wide variety of formally distinct nominal concepts which provide distinct perspectives for thinking and talking about the kind and its members, and that this range of formally distinct concepts can be generated by varying the types of elements a kind is constituted of, the kinds of elements that distinguish instances of a kind, the types of elements that characterize a kind, the number and types of explanatory properties they have principal connections to, and whether the kind has properties that characterize a principal division of instances of the kind. And what this suggests is that there is a good promise that we should be able to characterize a generative system which produces a wide variety of conceptual forms that encode the perspective provided by different classes of common sense concepts, the classes that each of these distinct concepts belongs to and that have distinct perspectives. That is one of the tasks for future work. But before we get there, I want to point out that conceptual form often encodes multiple perspectives. So for example, when we think of a kind, we can think of one abstract thing or an unlimited number of concrete things. When we think of a book, we can think of it as being simultaneously abstract and concrete. And so what conceptual form does is it provides a representation which is less like a photograph and more like a cubist painting, in that it provides multiple perspectives from which to think about the things that it allows us to think about. And in future work, we're hoping to continue to discover, elaborate, and investigate the conceptual form of a wider range of concepts and the system that generates them. We've also already started working on investigating the role of conceptual form in various aspects of cognition, including the interpretation of nominal metaphors. Paul Howard is doing work on the role of conceptual form and conceptual combination. And we think it's going to provide new insights into the representation of stereotypes and also the representation, acquisition, and processing of meanings of polysemous words, systematically polysemous words. Other questions that we hope to address are ones that ask, what are the linguistic and non-linguistic cues that allow children to discover which perspectives are provided by a given lexical item? And also, when children acquire the perspectives provided by the adult uses of a word. My own suspicion is that those are there from the earliest stages of lexical development, but of course, this is an empirical question. Thank you for your attention. And thanks to all the students, undergraduate and masters, as well as research assistants, and my collaborators around the world, and those that have inspired the ideas that I've been trying to develop here, as well as support from Hunter College and the PSC CUNY for the work done at Hunter College.